In great deeds, something abides. On great fields, something stays. Bodies disappear, but spirits linger. And reverent men and women from afar, generations that know us not and that we know not of, shall come to this deathless field to ponder and dream, and the power of the vision pass into their souls. This is the great reward of service. This is the mystery of Christ. To give life's best for such high sake, that it shall be found again unto life eternal. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain.
The Battle of Gettysburg is familiar to most Americans, but beyond the clash of two great armies are the stories of individual soldiers. As we toured these hallowed grounds, we learned how their lives were forever changed. In 1863, Gettysburg was just a small town of 3,000 people, mostly known for its Lutheran seminary and Gettysburg College. Students studied the scriptures while farmers tended to their fields and orchards in the rocky Pennsylvania soil. But in the background, a divide was widening between the northern and southern United States. No place was this more evident than in Washington, D.C. Politicians strongly disagreed on many points, including states' rights and the role of the federal government, but most of all, slavery. The argument tore the nation apart. Churches divided, splintering into new denominations. Christian abolitionists prayed for forgiveness of what they called the nation's original sin. For years, the states had been held together by negotiations and compromise, but time and patience ran out. With the election of anti-slavery President Abraham Lincoln in 1861, 11 southern states officially seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. Soon, the nations plunged into civil war. During the first 2 years of fighting, despite a smaller population and less industrial power, the Confederates won the majority of the battles, prolonging what the Union had hoped would be a short and easy conflict. In the summer of 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee knew that the war-weary North was tired of fighting. He hoped a decisive victory on Union soil would force Northern politicians to abandon the unpopular war and allow the nations to remain forever divided. Confederate troops began to take control of southern Pennsylvania. In need of supplies, the army forged its way across farms, taking whatever they could find. One southern division made its way to Gettysburg, looking for food, clothing, and shoes. In a move to protect Washington, Union troops began coming in from the south, and on July 1st, 1863, fighting began. The Battle of Gettysburg would prove to be the bloodiest in American history. In 3 days, nearly 50,000 men were killed or injured. It would become a turning point for both the war and our nation. Never since have Americans witnessed such a violent loss of so many lives on our own soil. Yet, in the middle of the horror, there were stories of courage, honor, and patriotism. As we toured Gettysburg, we reflected on the sacrifices made by the men and boys who fought this battle so long ago. And we discovered stories of hope, healing, and restoration that only God could provide. Our first stop was the historic Christ Church in downtown Gettysburg. In the early 1800s, the town's population consisted mainly of German immigrants, most of which were Lutheran Christians. In 1826, the Lutherans established a seminary in Gettysburg. Wanting to spread their faith to others, the Germans established Christ Church as an English-speaking congregation. But during the summer of 1863, soldiers used the church for something entirely different, as historian Ron Rock explained.
This area was Union territory, and Union officers coming up and down Chambersburg Street in front of the church here saw this building and decided to use it as a hospital. So starting on the morning of July 1st, 1863, wounded Union soldiers were brought in here.
At one point, Christ Church became home to over 140 wounded men. Bodies lay throughout the sanctuary, staining the wooden floor. Others were taken downstairs for crude surgeries. Windows were broken and shattered by bullets, and the earth shook from cannon fire. Unfortunately, not even the church was safe from the fighting.
There was an Army chaplain, his name was Horatio Howell, who was with the 90th Pennsylvania Volunteers. And Chaplain Howell came to this church to minister to the wounded while his men were fighting north and west of town. And at one point, Chaplain Howell decided to go out onto our front porch to get a breath of fresh air. One of the Confederates saw Howell standing at the top of the steps, and the Confederate demanded that Howell surrender. Howell started to argue and say, "You cannot take me prisoner, I'm a non-combatant," whereupon the Confederate shot and killed Howell.
At the steps now stands a monument of an open Bible, which reads Psalm 18:48. He delivereth me from mine enemies. Yea, thou liftest me up above those that rise against me. And Hebrews 11:4. He, being dead, yet speaketh. On the first day of fighting, the Union retreated. Confederate troops began kidnapping free African Americans that remained in town. 15-year-old Albertus McCreary watched in horror as their hired maid, old Liz Butler, marched past as a prisoner, condemned to slavery. However, in the chaos, Liz managed to escape her captors and run inside Christ Church, not stopping until she reached the top of the bell tower. Here she hid without food or water for 3 days. On July 4th, she found Albertus and explained where she'd been, thanking God for saving her life and her freedom. After learning about the church's important role in history, we opened the old hymnal to find a famous Civil War tune, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Written in 1861 by abolitionist Julia Ward Howe, the anti-slavery song became the theme of the Union Army. In the final verse, soldiers proclaim their dedication to the cause, singing, "As Christ died to make men holy, let us die to make men free." And it's to the stories of those soldiers that we now turn. But first, we had to meet our guide. Dennis Kutzner is an accomplished historian, pastor, and author. He's toured the battlefield over 75 times and loves to share the God stories of Gettysburg. While the Union may have lacked the leadership of Robert E. Lee, it still had many bold, courageous men among the Army's ranks. One of these men was Colonel Strong Vincent, who helped save the day for the Union on July 2nd. Dennis showed us where, at a place of great strategic importance, Little Round Top. Covered in honeysuckle and wildflowers, this rocky hill seemed peaceful and serene, a far cry from the violence that happened here in 1863. On the afternoon of July 2nd, Union Brigadier General G.K. Warren climbed Little Round Top to find hardly any troops in this valuable position. He knew having the high ground gave armies a distinct advantage and hurried to occupy the hill before the Confederates. A messenger was sent to find Brigadier General Barnes in hope that he could provide troops to hold the hill. However, before the messenger found Barnes, he encountered 26-year-old Colonel Strong Vincent. Vincent did not have a long military background. Prior to the war, he practiced law in Erie, Pennsylvania, after graduating from Harvard. But when war broke out, his sense of duty led him to volunteer for the Army. He wrote to his wife, whom he married the day he enlisted.
"If I fall, remember, you have given your husband to the most righteous cause that ever widowed a woman."
Vincent quickly rose through the ranks and was promoted to colonel. Following the death of his commanding officer, Vincent assumed control of the 83rd Pennsylvania Regiment. He had been raised an Episcopalian, but it is unknown what role faith played in his adult life. Vincent did, however, have a very strong sense of loyalty and patriotism. Just days before his arrival in Gettysburg as his brigade marched through Maryland, Vincent looked up at the Union flag and remarked,
"What death more glorious can any man desire than to die on the soil of old Pennsylvania, fighting for that flag?"
Now on the soil of Gettysburg, Vincent's quick action would help turn the tide of the battle. After stopping the messenger, he demanded that the rider tell his orders.
Vincent grabbed the horse's reins of that rider and says, "What are your orders?" And he says, "I'm looking for General Barnes." He says, "Well, I don't know where he is," but he says, "What are your orders?" He would not let go of the reins. Finally, the officer says, "General Warren wants a brigade on that hill." Vincent said, "I'll take the responsibility."
With only minutes to spare, Vincent brought his men up Little Round Top to assist Warren as the enemy approached. Fighting broke out and the Confederates began to put serious pressure on his regiment. In the confusion, some of the soldiers thought the signal was given to retreat and began falling back at a critical moment. Sensing the danger, Vincent climbed atop a boulder and brandished a horsewhip given to him by his wife, shouting to the troops,
"Do not give an inch!"
The retreat ceased, but a bullet struck Vincent in his leg and stomach, causing a wound that would end his life 5 days later. Although he may have fallen away from his Christian upbringing, Vincent's last days brought him back to the Lord. He was taken to a nearby farm, but doctors were unable to help him. As he lay dying from his wounds, he began to recite the Lord's Prayer, a remnant of his Episcopal upbringing.
On earth as it is in heaven.
Vincent's troops returned to the boulder where he'd stood with his horsewhip and carved out a reminder in the stone. Head of Union forces General George Meade recommended Colonel Vincent for a promotion to Brigadier General, but it's unlikely he ever knew. If you look closely at the anonymous figure atop the Pennsylvania 83rd Monument, it bears a striking resemblance to the colonel who died on the soil of old Pennsylvania, fighting for his flag. On the other side of Little Round Top, another hero had arrived to hold off the Confederate surge coming up the hill. Colonel Patrick Henry O'Rourke, known as Paddy, was born in Ireland and moved to the U.S. with his family in search of a better life. As a young man, he attended West Point and graduated valedictorian of the class of 1861. A devout Roman Catholic, Paddy had a strong sense of duty and dedication. His work with the Army Corps of Engineers helped prepare the defenses for Washington, D.C. By the time he reached Gettysburg, he'd been promoted to colonel of the 140th New York Regiment. On the second day of the battle, General Warren came to him, desperately in need.
The firing that's going on here on the south end of the hill, because of acoustics, Warren can't hear it. He doesn't hear the firing. So he himself goes down on the other side of the hill, and he runs into Patrick Henry O'Rourke from Rochester, New York.
Warren, not knowing that Colonel Strong Vincent's men were already fighting on the hill, asked O'Rourke to send his troops. O'Rourke obliged and headed up the hill, hoping to inspire his men by leading from the front rather than the rear. As things looked bleak for Vincent, Paddy O'Rourke crested the hill and shouted, "Over here, boys!" pointing with his sword. Immediately, his men rushed to assist Vincent's troops, but in that moment, O'Rourke was struck in the throat with a bullet and fell on the battlefield. Years later, Paddy O'Rourke's regiment returned to erect a monument to their beloved colonel. His face shines in the sun as tourists rub his nose, believing it will bring the luck of the Irish. Above his head are the words fraternity, valor, patriotism, and duty.
And when those men came across the hill that day and their commander said, "Over here, boys," and they all knew what that meant, what they had to do, they didn't have time to write home, didn't have time to do anything else, didn't have time to think. All they had time to do was to do their duty. And they did it. And I ask us here today, we each have a duty. We each have a destiny. Even if we're in retirement, we have a responsibility. We have a plan that God has for our life. Are we serving the Lord? Are we giving to Him? Will we be faithful? Would they be able to put on our tombstone? Duty.
That same day, at the far end of the Union line on the southern side of Little Round Top, stood Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He was not your typical soldier. A professor from Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, he spoke 9 different languages and taught religion and rhetoric. When war broke out, he felt called to serve the Union, frustrated at his colleagues' lack of enthusiasm for what he saw as a just cause. He wrote the governor of Maine, saying,
I fear this war will not cease until men of the North are willing to leave good positions and sacrifice the dearest personal interests to rescue our country from desolation.
Under the pretense of traveling to Europe for his studies, Chamberlain took a 2-year leave of absence and then immediately enlisted in the army. What he lacked in military experience, he made up for in dedication. By July 2, 1863, he had become colonel of the 20th Maine Regiment. At the orders of Strong Vincent, Chamberlain was instructed to hold the end of the Union line to the last on the south side of Little Round Top, as Confederate troops led by Colonel William Oates from the 15th Alabama Regiment charged the hill again and again.
So by the 4th or 5th time that the Alabamans had come up the hill, Chamberlain realizes many of the guys were literally out of ammunition. They had used the ammunition from their supply, and they had used the ammunition that was in the guns and in the pockets of other soldiers that were dead or wounded. They were out. What was the only thing you could do? Well, Chamberlain says, gosh, there's only one thing I know to do, and that's to charge these guys. To run down this hill and charge them, and hoping, he figured out they've got to be as tired as we are.
The Alabamans had already marched 20 miles that day and been unable to find water to refill their canteens. With nothing to lose, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge down the hill.
By all accounts, the men already figured out what they were going to do, so the order was not really an order. But when he ordered up the charge, everybody lined up, they all charged down the hill. And their momentum, running into the Confederates, they were spent. Most of them gave up or turned around and ran back out of the way. So he saves the day.
This charge was successful beyond all my hopes. We took twice as many prisoners as we had men in our ranks. The result of this movement, beyond question, was the saving of Round Top itself.
Chamberlain survived the end of the war, going on to serve as governor of Maine and president of Bowdoin College. In 1893, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his courage here on the battlefield.
We know not of the future and cannot plan for it much, but we can hold our spirits and our bodies so pure and high that we can determine and know what manner of men we will be when the hour strikes that calls to noble action. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain.
Next, Dennis shared the story of a man who died at Gettysburg but found eternal life. He led us through the rain to Soldiers National Cemetery, which holds the distinction as America's first national military graveyard. The cemetery was primarily the work of Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin, who contacted politicians around the country to ensure proper burials for the troops who died in the battle. Soldiers National Cemetery is best known as the place where Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. Here, nearly 4 months after the battle, with thousands of bodies remaining to be buried, they dedicated the site. The keynote speaker was Edward Everett, one of the most renowned orators of the time. He spoke for nearly 2 hours, followed by a simple speech from President Lincoln that began with the words, 87 years ago.
Everett leaned over to him and said, "You said in 2.5 minutes more than I was able to say in 2 hours."
One of many buried on these grounds is the Union soldier William O. Doubleday. Originally from Sherburne, Vermont, Doubleday had been drafted into the Union Army. On the 3rd day of the battle, he was shot while fighting against the Confederates.
It was during that conflict that Doubleday is wounded in his leg, and usually if one of those 57, 58 caliber lead bullets hit an exposed limb, it shattered the bones. And at that time, the only way a surgeon could fix that is to go above the shattering and saw it off, and hopefully they would live.
Nothing could have prepared the government for the immense number of casualties caused by the conflict. Thousands of volunteers, many of them Christian groups, joined together to help the injured. Doubleday was taken to St. Francis Xavier Church in the middle of town, where the Catholic sisters tended to the wounded. Here on the floor of the sanctuary, near the altar, Doubleday met a man named George Stewart. A successful businessman, Stewart was also head of the United States Christian Commission. The group ministered to hurt soldiers, providing food and helping write letters home to loved ones. Before Doubleday left his home in Vermont, his wife expressed her hope that he would return safely and as a good Christian. The couple took a moment for their 12-year-old son to pray for his father.
So here he comes to Gettysburg and realizes now he may not survive, and he knows his wife's a believer, his children are believers, he's not. By his testimony, he's been an evil man, a wicked man. He tells this all to Stewart, and then he begins to weep and to cry. And Stewart prays with him what we would consider today like a sinner's prayer. And Doubleday receives the Lord and is born again, and as a result of that, he's in heaven. He came to Gettysburg to fight a war, to fight and be in a conflict, which he did. He didn't come here to find Christ. But God had a different story and journey plan because of the prayers of his wife and his children.
His wife arrived in Gettysburg to see him before he died on August 14th. Rather than return the body to Vermont, she decided to have him buried here at the National Cemetery. A year later, George Stewart received a letter from the widow of William O. Doubleday, thanking him for being the answer to her and her children's prayers.
It's been estimated that roughly 25% of all the soldiers in the Civil War were Christian, both North and South. And I had an atheist that was here at the park that I used to talk to, and Greg would say to me, he says, you know, only 1/4 of the soldiers. Well, if there were 4 million soldiers that fought, that's 1 million soldiers were Christian, besides the number of men who found Christ as a result of that military experience.
At that moment, standing in the rain at the National Cemetery, Dennis asked us to pray with him. We prayed for all those we knew who did not know Jesus, that we could be like George Stewart and share the message of salvation with them.
We agree together for all family, friends, people that we've worked with around us that we know that are not Christian, that are not saved. We agree together here as touching their lives for their salvation, that you'll get the word to them and they'll respond in faith and be born again. We pray this, Lord, sincerely in Jesus' name. And everybody said together, Amen.
Doubleday was one of thousands injured or killed on the third day of battle, when the Confederates attacked the Union line near this group of trees. Known as Pickett's Charge for Major General George Pickett, the attack proved disastrous. At the base of the trees stands a monument for the high water mark of the Confederacy, remembering the furthest the Army ever advanced into Union territory. Viewed as one of the major turning points in the battle and the war, things may have been different had the Confederates' plans worked that day. Those who did make it this far were met with brutal fighting. Instead of shells, cannons fired shrapnel against enemy infantry at close range. Soldiers were reduced to fighting hand-to-hand with bayonets, sticks, and even rocks. Yet the line held. In the end, the Union won the battle and eventually the war, reuniting the country. Decades later, the surviving veterans returned to Gettysburg.
The word was that there were going to be men from Pickett's Charge and from the Union who were going to restage Pickett's Charge. They put the Confederate guys just a few yards over the wall that way, stood the Union guys on this side of the wall like they would have been, and they said now they're going to reenact the charge. All right, so the Confederate guys start toward the Union line. Literally, as they begin walking, suddenly the Union guys step across the wall and begin walking toward them, and the crowd begins to cry, "No, no, that's not how it happened." And they met each other on the field and wept and cried, hugging one another. And the crowd was hushed.
A half-century after the deadliest battle on U.S. soil, the former enemies embraced as old friends in a moving testimony of God's healing power. Only He could bring together the two broken halves of a nation and make it stronger than ever before. We saw the hand of God throughout our tour, in the courage of strong Vincent, the honor of Patrick O'Rourke, the loyalty of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the salvation of William O. Doubleday, and in the reconciliation of two great armies. Out of war, God brought peace. A century and a half later, this leaves a powerful lesson for us.
Let's let the real combat that we have not be against flesh and blood, but let's do the warfare, and let's do it as bravely as the men here did for us.
Here on the battlefield, Christ was ever present in the lives of these men, and I hope He's that way in your life, too.
Cornerstone Television wishes to thank all our faithful viewers whose consistent prayers and financial support have made this program possible.